Okay, let's head to the second question that we're dealing with here as it relates to the um, the call of God, and that is, if so, if God does specifically call people to ministry, how can you know if you are called to that ministry? Um, well, that's a very good and honest question, and it's not an easy one to answer. And the reason it's not easy is because there is no one specific way that God indicates that He is directing someone toward ministry. And some of the things that God uses are more objective, others are more subjective. What do I mean by that? Well, objective things may refer to specific circumstances that God brings you into as you're thinking about His will, or perhaps specific people that come and actually talk to you about that sort of thing. Perhaps you're reading the Bible and a specific passage really jumps out at you when you're dealing with all this, and it just seems like God is really using that. Those I would call more objective, even though they may contain an element of subjectivity. Other things are very much subjective. For instance, feelings. Say, man, I just have a burden to do this. I've just always wanted to do this. I've always had a desire to minister to this kind of people, or to this place in the world, or something like that. And those types of feelings and inclinations are very much more on the subjective end of the spectrum, but that doesn't make them worthless. Or it doesn't mean that they're not to be considered in 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 dealing with the call of God. Here's what I would say to you, to put it as simply as I can. Don't ask so much the question, what does God use to call someone to ministry, but what doesn't He use? In other words, it's really more a question of the sum total of everything that's going on in your life that God puts together. He weaves them together to show you that this is what He wants you to do. And so, if you're looking for that big sign, that, Macedonian call, or that, the voice of the Holy Spirit, you're probably not going to get very far. Remember that in Acts 13 and 16, the only two passages in Acts that actually use the word call related to ministry, um, uh, the way that God called was probably different than what He normally does today. For example, in chapter 13, the Spirit said, "Separate me, Barnabas and Saul." Well, how did the Spirit say it? Well, in the previous verse, Luke tells us that there were prophets and teachers in the church in Antioch. And so, if there were prophets there, it just makes sense that the Spirit of God spoke through those who had the gift of prophecy, which I do not believe continues today. And he through those prophets, He made it clear that He was calling out Barnabas and Saul. And in chapter 16, it was a vision of a man in Macedonia saying, "Come over and help us." Now, there was a time when it was not uncommon for people to say, if you want to be a missionary, then have you had your Macedonian call yet? And I just think that's a total misunderstanding of what happened in that situation. The vision of the man coming over, saying, "Come over and help us," was a very unusual situation in the book of Acts. That kind of direction doesn't happen consistently in Acts. In fact, as you read the book of Acts, you'll discover that more often than not, God leads people through very natural means, rather than the supernatural visions or the Spirit speaking through prophets or somebody like that, something like that. Just give you an example. When Paul began his second missionary journey, and he met up with Timothy in Lystra, the Bible simply says in Acts 16 that Paul wanted Timothy to go along. That's all it says. No vision, no voice of the Spirit. Paul wanted Timothy to go along. And what happened? Timothy went. Timothy's entire life was changed from that moment forward. And he ended up becoming a servant alongside of Paul for several years, and so on. Now think about that. Would you be comfortable with your whole life changing in a moment because someone wanted you to come along and help them. You'd have to be pretty confident that that person was really walking with God and really knew what he or she was talking about, right? And of course, Timothy did. He believed that Paul knew what he was talking about, and he went along. And then, and so there's a case where Timothy's call to ministry was something very natural. God used an individual that came into his life, a faithful servant, who wanted him to go along. And Timothy, of course, I don't believe was forced into that. I think he had the opportunity to say no, but because he knew Paul and respected him and believed that he was a man led by the Spirit of God, and who knows what other circumstances God may have used to prepare Timothy's heart, he ends up going along. Okay, so again, don't ask so much what specific things does God use. Ask what does he not use. And that means that everything that's going on in your life, you should be paying attention to, and be asking, how might God be using this to lead me? What impact is that circumstance or that individual or that opportunity going to have on God's direction in my life? And of course, it goes without saying that maintaining a daily walk with God is the most important thing. If you decide to take 4 or 5 years off, of serving the Lord and walking with him, and then do some things you want to do, and then come back later on and decide you're going to follow the Lord, you're making a big mistake, because it may be exactly during that period of 4 or 5 years or whatever that God decides to use some specific things to direct your life. Okay. The next question: do you believe there is such a thing as a call to missions? I do believe that God does specifically lead people into missionary work. But I also believe that he does the same thing for other people, okay, who work in other types of ministries or even what we call secular work. Let me make a comment here. We use the terms sacred and secular pretty freely. We talk about people who go into the ministry, and then we talk about others that are going to do secular work, So I may be talking to a young man who says, I believe God is calling me into the ministry. And maybe there's another fella standing next to him. I say, what about you? He says, well, I'm just going to get a secular job. And without even thinking about it, we make a dichotomy between ministry and what is sacred and other kinds of work which are secular. And I really believe that we make something of a mistake by doing that. Let me explain what I mean. The idea of the sacred and secular actually goes back to the days of Plato and his philosophies, and not just him, but he had something to do with that, an impact on that, and even in the church we have the clergy and the laity, especially in the Catholic Church, using that language. And I recognize that there is a distinction between leadership and the sheep, the shepherd and the sheep in a church. But I'm concerned that we perhaps sometimes overstate this distinction between sacred and secular. Secular is a word that today is often used for that which kind of leaves God out. We live we talk about living in an increasingly secularized society. What are we saying? Well, among other things, we're saying a society that leaves God out and does everything by its own volition. And I think that unfortunately that kind of thinking can even creep in to a discussion of the will of God. If God's not calling you to the mission field or to the pastorate, then you're kind of relegated to secular ministry or secular work rather. And and for that reason, some people feel like they're inferior to others that are going into ministry. Even in a home, let's say that there are 2 brothers in a home, and one of the brothers feels called of God to serve as a pastorate, and the other brother feels led to be an artist and to use commercial art or graphic design or something like that. And there's a tendency sometimes on the part of the one brother to look down on the other, or vice versa, because one's called to ministry, the other's not. Even parents have to be careful that they don't seem to favor children or talk up the children who have given their lives to serve in ministry. And so, yes, I do believe that God does direct people specifically to missionary work. And I think that's what happened with Timothy. If Timothy had not gone with the Apostle Paul, he still would have been involved in ministry in the general sense of the word by being faithful there in Lystra, evangelizing people in his community, trying to live for Christ and represent his Lord. But when he became a follower of Paul and joined Paul, I think there is a more vocational sense in which he went into ministry. And by the way, the word vocation, as you may know, in the Greek language is actually the word for calling. And so when you talk about the call of God, you talk about vocational ministry, you're really talking about the same thing. Okay? But again, that does not make that in any way superior to another kind of work that God may call someone to do. One thing I want you to keep in mind is that throughout the 2,000 years of church history, a very, very small percentage of God's servants have been the pastors and the vocational missionaries. You know, the vast, vast majority of all of those who pertain to the Church of Jesus Christ have been people that we might call those in secular work. Again, I try to resist that term because I think it communicates the wrong thing. But when Jesus said, I will build my church, he knew that a very small percentage of those builders, those who would work for him, would actually be in pastoral ministry. Now, am I trying to dissuade you from going into pastoral ministry or missionary work? Am I speaking in such a way here as to minimize the need for missionaries and pastors? Absolutely not. But what I am talking about here is the sovereignty of God and the way God chooses to use people and the value of those people in the work to which he has called them. And that's what I'm trying to keep straight here. And so, I mean, absolutely. I even heard someone say that God doesn't call everyone to missions, but everyone who's a believer should at least wrestle with that option. And we could debate that, but I think there is some value in that statement. If you're convinced that God is not leading you into ministry work as a believer, I would like to think that you have at least considered it. Is it possible that God could be leading me to something like that? And if he's not, he's not. Don't force it. All right? All right, really quickly, the next question is everybody a missionary, whether vocationally or in whatever capacity he or she may be working? I'm simply going to say about this one that if we make no distinction at all between vocational missionaries and, other believers, and we say that everybody's a missionary, then in a sense, nobody's a missionary, if you know what I'm saying. You completely lose the distinction of the word. Remember that the Moravians did that. Zinzendorf that we studied, that group, had the idea that no one is specifically called to vocational missions. You just sense God's leading, you pick up your toolbox and you take your work to wherever God's leading you, and you be a missionary there. And so I do believe that we ought to maintain some distinction. Ephesians chapter 4 says that Jesus Christ appointed some to be apostles, prophets, and those two are temporary. They were part of the foundation of the church. And then he says evangelists and pastors and teachers. Now, we know what pastors and teachers are, and some think that pastor-teacher is the one designation, kind of a hyphenated pastor-teacher idea. But what is the evangelist there? Well, I doubt it's referring to somebody that travels around and does week-long revival meetings. That may have been part of it, but that's a little bit more of a modern concept. The word evangelist there may actually be referring to those who are involved in what we call church planting type work. They're not pastoring a particular flock, but they're helping to get churches started, like Paul did on his journeys. He did not stay at those churches as the permanent pastor. They appointed elders to take over those churches, and Paul and Timothy and others who were with him moved on. And I think that may be part of the idea. Philip, the evangelist, not Philip the apostle, but Philip who went to Samaria and then went down to Gaza and met the Ethiopian eunuch, he ended up settling in around the area of the city of Caesarea in Israel. And when Paul meets up with him at the end of his third journey, he discovers that Philip has four virgin daughters who are prophesying, and he's been working that area, and he is still designated Philip the evangelist. You can see that in Acts chapter 21. I tend to think that the idea there is that Philip settled in that area, probably Caesarea and the surrounding villages and towns, and was busily winning people to Christ and starting churches in those communities. And so again, yes, everybody is involved somehow in what we call Great Commission ministry. Right? We're all to be missionaries in the sense of being faithful witnesses for Christ, representatives, ambassadors for Christ. But again, I do think that God does set some apart specifically for a ministry like this, as we see in Ephesians chapter 4 and other related passages.